Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's go to Barcelona and talk to somebody whose opinions and good nature I value immensely. It's Mary Kaldor. And Mary, I've known for years and years and years, and she's just absolutely just about the smartest person I know. And she's in Barcelona. She normally lives in England. She's in Barcelona for a couple of months to give a course. So I'm going to ask her how she's doing and what all is what she's going to teach. So good morning, Mary. It's morning for me, but late afternoon for you. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Okay, so retirement isn't really retirement, is it? There is no such thing for folks like us. And
No,
and you are in Barcelona, a lovely, wonderful place. And tell me what you're up to. I understand you are writing your final magnum opus, wonderful book on New World Order. And then that's going to summarize everything you've learned in your illustrious career. And you are also giving a course about your new book. So I know what I want to ask you about it. Okay, right?
yeah, absolutely. So I've been writing this book for quite a long time. And as you say, some of my students said, why don't you bring everything together and write your theory of everything? And actually, it's been a very, very difficult book to write. It's very difficult to write your theory of everything because you always think of objections.
Mm-hmm.
And also, as you may know, when you get older, it gets harder to hold a lot of different things in your mind at once.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I thought that was the main reason why I found it difficult. But interestingly enough, I went out to lunch with a very old friend. I don't know if you ever met him, Narcis Serra, who was a wonderful Spanish politician who was responsible for civilianizing the Spanish military. And he said the problem when you get older is that you get more filled with doubt. And I think that's also true. I used to be quite confident of my views, but I find myself questioning them more and more. And it's trying to understand political change in a way over my lifetime. So it's actually a story. It starts in 1989, which was in a way, the moment of my intellectual formation, I feel. And it's the story of what happened since and why, but it starts. But the book has, in a way, at the starting point for the book, is something I was very influenced by when I was young, which were theories of long cycles in history and moments of paradigm change. And when I was young, I worked in something called the Science Policy Research Unit, and we thought a lot about long waves in economic history, which were characterized by different technologies over time. And I was very struck by the fact that in other fields of social science, for instance, international relations, there are lots of theories of long waves in world order or long waves in war. And I was really interested in how these two connected. So the starting point is really, and I don't want to prove the point about long waves, but the starting point is really that we're at a moment in history when the organization or the narrative that we have about world order, and we have several competing narratives, no longer fit the deep-rooted economic, social, and technological change. But my interest is not so much in explaining what all that is, although I will try to do that. It's in how do we get through paradigm shifts? If you look at these long wave theories, there's always a moment which people often call critical junctures when change happens. And somehow, usually it's a major war. And somehow in goes one period of history and out comes another. And I'm interested in, well, what happens in these periods? So one important idea that animates the book is the idea that I call experimental junctures, moments of history when politicians really don't know what to do, but they experiment with different approaches, and some approaches are incredibly disastrous, like killing all Jews, or, as is happening at the moment, taking over the Panama Canal or giving in to Russia. And it's only when you hit upon less disastrous approaches that you lay the basis for a new period of history. And that doesn't mean you will hit upon the right approach, but it's experimental junctures may go on for a very long time. So that's part of the story.
I have to ask, I have never read one word really about long waves. So you're into something that doesn't connect to anything I know. Are you saying that these experimental junctures are somehow occur at a certain period in long waves, or would obviously experimental junctures, I would think, can occur at all kinds of times, especially if there's a crisis going on that is a little baffling. So
well, I think major cataclysmic experimental junctures occur at the moments when, if you like, waves in world order are out of step with economic and technological waves. So actually, the way I would say it is that economic change happens all the time because of markets. Markets are a mechanism for change. But political change either happens very slowly in long periods of history, or they happen dramatically. And it's because the rate of change of institutions is different from the rate of change of economies that you reach moments of huge contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'll go back to experimental junctures. It's quite good explaining this to you because I need to learn to explain it a bit more simply. But the other thing to say about the other idea, which is, I think, something new, is the idea that the experiments are kind of drawn from the ideas that are around in civil society. And I'm sure this is something you are familiar with. People also talk about cycles of social movements. Mm-hmm. And at certain moments, social movements win or lose. And when they win, their ideas get accepted onto governmental agendas. And also they become, as it were, institutionalized. You know, the labor movement became institutionalized as social democratic and labor parties and trades unions.
Right.
And historically, these experimental junctures have occurred at moments of revolution and war, which I think are linked. So the Napoleonic Wars was one such moment. Mm-hmm. The wars of the middle of the 19th century were another moment, and obviously the two world wars were another moment, and now we're in another moment.
Right.
And so I have a very kind of specific idea of civil society, which is that, in fact, what we mean by civil society, well, we mean a million different things. But if you think about it conceptually, is that over the last 300 years, we've developed a whole set of mechanisms for the non-violent resolution of conflict in society, whether we're talking about justice mechanisms, elections, all of these things. And all of them in a way, and at the same time, it also means space for social movements. And in a way, all of these movements these mechanisms are kind of the consequence of the, if you like, the institutionalization of social movements. It's offering a sort of bit of hope. I think because 1989 was my formative moment, I still believe in agency, as no doubt you do, despite all the horrible things that happen. So it's about how important agency is in these moments. But having said, so the first part of the book really sets the scene, and what I argue was that what came together after the Second World War was, on the one hand, the Cold War, which, as you know from the past, I call imaginary war. And it was a framework, a binary framework for the world. And on the other hand, which I think was true of both communism and capitalism, the rise of a model of development which people call Fordism. So mass production, intensive use of fossil fuels, cars, all of these things became terribly important in the Second World War. And were kind of, in a way, what I argue is that the Cold War provided a framework for Fordism. You look very unsure of that.
I am. Okay. Now, what do I pursue here? I'm not sure. This Fordism thing is, what's that got to do with anything?
I think the basic argument is that we've never really managed to dismantle the fundamental Cold War structures. We started dismantling it in the post-89 period. But actually, along came the war on terror, and then came the return of geopolitics, and that legitimized the continued structures of the Cold War, which were completely out of keeping with really globalization, which was happening after 1989, fundamental changes in technology, in the way we ran our economy, and so on, which were completely at variance with our political institutions. So that's how I see the contradiction.
Are you thinking of like NATO, or when you say the institutions of the Cold War?
I'm thinking of NATO. I'm thinking of military structures all over the world. I'm thinking of military structures in Russia and in China.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of the national organization of the world, despite the rise of global institutions and despite globalization.
Well, what is the incongruity? Where is it that militarization, or in NATO, it's and other alliances, are somehow incompatible with economic globalization? I guess is that your assumption?
It is my assumption, yes. I think we need well, if you like, politics is still organized at a national level. And what we have at a global level is the rise of neoliberalism, which is another story.
Rise and fall of neoliberalism now, maybe.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's just, I was just listening to a seminar about Syria. And what was striking is the way the new Syrian regime is already adopting neoliberal policies.
Tell me, is Trump a neoliberal? I mean,
Yes, in a way he is. I think what neoliberalism did was two things. First of all, neoliberalism really constructed oligarchy. Through privatization and contracting out, it constructed oligarchy. And at the same time, it contributed to extreme inequality and produced a sort of vulnerable set of left behind people who were able to be mobilized by the oligarchs. So it did those two things. It did inequality, and at the same time, it constructed a whole new class of capitalists who are entirely dependent on the state, which is a sort of, and that's what we mean by oligarchs.
States differ. The question, I think the interesting and dramatic question now is, are we talking about democratic states in the future? Are we talking about, authoritarian states? I mean, the US is becoming overnight an authoritarian state. If you watch, the speech last night of
No, I completely
Congress.
agree. I think what Trump and Putin are a huge assault on democracy.
Huge what?
Assault on democracy.
Right.
And I think that's what Putin is about. I mean, all these silly Europeans who somehow think they can pull him back into Europe, he's fundamentally opposed to the European Union and democracy. The fact that J.D. Vance came to Munich and the only people he wanted to see was the AfD is evidence of that.
I agree. So what we
So at the moment, we're in the middle of a huge struggle between authoritarianism and democracy.
That's exactly. That's what the issue is. But
I feel we can't solve the problems of democracy and our economic problems except at a global level.
Okay, I'm happy with that. But also, Trump.
Well, I think that's maybe maybe that's the argument that it all comes down to.
No, but when I'm stuck with when trying to fit the notion of neoliberalism into this, because I'm not sure I know what it is.
Okay. So I'm saying that these changes come about because of the rise and fall of movements. And, for the 50s and 60s, there was kind of mostly a consensus. And then you started to get reactions both from the left and the right. From the left, people like us were concerned about issues like peace and environment and democracy and women's rights and all of these issues. And the right, but it was all a kind of frustration with the overbearing state, I think, both from left and right. But whereas the left wanted to democratize, the right wanted to minimize the state and escape. And
so where is Trump in that polarization? I mean, if you say that the tension, maybe this is a past tension that you're seeing between building a strong democratic state and minimizing states, period.
I think what happened was that, well, the way I'm telling the story at the moment is that neoliberalism produced these oligarchy types who needed a narrative you can't win power by saying, I want money. You have to have a narrative. And so Reagan picked on the Christian right. Thatcher had her Falklands moment. And they all pick on a kind of scapegoat theory of history. And for Trump, it's the scapegoat theory. Everybody's against America. I'm against immigrants who eat animals, who eat pets. I think Canada and Panama should all be part of the United States. The mad ideology is what's taken over at this point, I would say.
Do you have a theory about where it's going?
The theory about where it's going is really depressing. Because what I think is that what happened in Syria, what happened in Bosnia, what happens in large parts of Africa is a kind of long-term intimation of where it's going. that these authoritarians thrive on fear and the extraction of resources. And that combination actually requires violence. And so the most likely outcome of all this is a long-term violent condition that will be very difficult to change. But on the other hand, as I said, I still believe in agency. And actually, in all the new wars that I study, there are always very active civil society people, because those societies would collapse without civil society. They just would literally collapse. Civil society provide humanitarian support, they do everything. They provide schools, they provide clinics, they do all of those things. And it's particularly striking actually in Ukraine, where, do you know that 15% of defense spending has been crowdfunded?
From the world or from Ukrainians?
From Ukrainians,
Right?
some of them living abroad.
Okay. I'm not too surprised. Okay.
But anyway, the point is that, during the 1990s, as a consequence of the 1990s was a moment of institutionalization, and we did set up some institutions like the ICC. We increased the emphasis on human rights and so on. And I do think, I think whether we're talking about Gaza, where we saw the ICJ decision and the ICC decision, I do think, interestingly, sort of global public opinion really does support the idea of a kind of liberal human rights-based order.
Okay. I think probably. Mm-hmm.
And so that's where our hope lies, and our hope lies that the Europeans will get it. I mean, they've been terrible on Palestine, but they are beginning to get it, that they've got to support Ukraine. And if they could really begin to get it, that also requires, I mean, I keep saying that, it also requires the opposite of neoliberalism, which isn't necessarily a return to statism. It's more about global redistribution than about national redistribution. And the EU is in a key position to be able to do that. And it's in a key position. I mean, it could be hugely increasing borrowing from the central bank. It hardly has any borrowing. It could be hugely increasing taxation of multinationals and the rich and of financial speculation. And it could be spending all that on climate change, on welfare, on education. And that, it needs to be at the level of the EU, not at the level of the nation states. The nation states are completely stuck. They're kind of confined by the IMF. They have no... So that, I guess, is what I'm trying... But I can't see that happening without a notion of a rights-based liberal world order. I emphasize rights because, everybody talks about a rules-based order, but they don't necessarily include rights.
Right. Got it.
And it has to include economic and social rights.
Well, I think I would be on your page on that.
I think I need to learn how to explain it in a few minutes.
You say there are moments of experimentation, and I have to hope that gives a little opening at some point where innovation can there can be a experimentation with new institutions that are capable of addressing. Now, frankly, I don't think your opinion or any other politician or political analyst is taking account of two of the things that are coming at us that are going to change everything. And one is AI, and the other is global climate change. And those two things are going to happen so fast and make so many new challenges that we have no grasp of how to address. And both of them, in my opinion, do require global political institutions to solve them. They need to be democratic. And I don't see where we're going to get them. I mean, that's really the question. In terms of what you said, where would we, where can we pin our hopes on getting the kinds of changes that we need from, I mean,
I totally agree with you, although I'm still getting my head around what AI really means. I find it really difficult. I agree with you about both climate change and AI. And I guess that's actually part of the story because the institutions are biased against, at least against climate change. And I guess that's what I mean about Fordist institutions. They're actually biased in favor of oil.
That's absolutely true. And I spent a lot of my energy, probably the great majority of my energy working on that issue. But I was listening last night to two guys, Ezra Klein and some guy who's an expert on AGI. The point is, AGI within the next 2 or 3 years is going to mean that there is no comparison between the intelligence in the human population and this machine, and it'll be necessary and will happen that policies will and decisions will be made by machines because they're so much smarter. And they're already, the reason that Musk is tearing up the US government is to make it easier for these machines to take over. And they will take over. And I'm not even sure whether I like the idea or not. They might be better. I don't think we can predict whether they're more ethical. So, but I think we can't. I think we can't leave them out. I don't think we can assume that they're well to maybe make almost mockery of what you've said. If there are long waves of things, then you can sort of predict, what's coming up in a wave. I don't know anything about wave theory, but you're
well, the long waves. This what you've just said fits totally the long wave theory, actually.
Really?
Yeah. So there are huge waves in technological development, and we're just at the beginning of the AI wave.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it fits quite well with that sort of approach. But what I was going to say is that I think we need to be thinking about what's needed. And I'm a member of the UN Secretary General's advisory panel on disarmament. And we had a meeting last week where we were discussing AI. Mm-hmm. And I said what we needed was a World Technology Organization that would monitor, regulate, drew up a set of principles. And the person who was most enthusiastic about this idea was the Chinese member.
I wish I could believe that you could come up with some principles that if you just rationally and consistently applied those principles, we'd be all right. But no.
Well, I mean, then you're not really believing in agency.
I hadn't thought about that. Well, do I? I don't know.
I mean, but what I'm trying, let me just say something else about democracy. I think when people think about, there's a huge problem about democracy at the national level because we have very limited choices at the national level because of globalization. But the answer isn't to have democracy at a global level. The answer is that the job of the global institutions is to address global bads So there's space both at national and local levels to be able to make democratic decisions. So it doesn't mean that international institutions shouldn't be accountable, but it means that if, I draw a distinction between, that's all in my book, and I can see my book's covering far too much stuff. But if we're drawing a distinction between procedural, I draw a distinction between procedural and substantive democracy. And procedural democracy is having elections, having a rule of law, having freedom of association. But substantial democracy is about being able to influence the decisions which affect your life or being able to participate in them. And the problem is that because so much is happening at a global level, and because the institutions are so militarized and stuck in old Fordist assumptions, it's very difficult for us to influence the decisions that affect our lives. So what kind of governance multi-level governance would make that possible? And my argument is that the job at the global level is not so much to be directly accountable, because the world there's so many people, we'd never, if you had majority decisions and everything else. Rather, the job of the global institutions is to create as greater possibilities as possible at a local level to make the decisions that affect your life, which means regulating or taxing global bads like climate change or AI. Well, AI might be a global good or a global bad.
You mean that somehow locally you're going to be able to affect taxation policy for the government, for the whole nation?
Or for perhaps your local area?
Well, I don't give a hoot about my local area. Frankly, I don't pay any attention. I don't even know who the city councilor is. I don't pay attention to local.
I much prefer my local area. I mean, Britain is my state, but Brighton, where I live, I love Brighton. And I'm very concerned about who is the local council and all that kind of stuff.
Well, we're different. I can't bother with that. I got to solve the world. I can't take care of my little town, a neighborhood.
But solving the world is partly being able to solve the problems of your little town. That's exactly the point.
I don't think it is at the level of little towns. I think what I need is the government. Okay, here, I'm taking over. This is your show, and I don't want to explain my theory. I want to hear more about yours. But I do have a different. I think I have a different take on it. I think I really do want ways of creating human control over big institutional decisions, corporate decisions, global, international decisions.
But I completely agree with that.
Okay.
I agree with that. I'd call those global bads.
See, I believe in citizens' assemblies. I believe that I don't believe in voting in the you go and elect somebody. I think the people in elections just make very stupid decisions because they don't think about it or talk about it in advance. They go in the voting booth and they just pull any old lever that they see. But if you create panels of people who are really representative of the population, a sortition, and you put them together and you make them think together for weeks or months with people coming in and presenting a variety of different ideas and interests, the outcome is generally better than, at least as good, if not better, than if you elect Congress people or parliamentarians.
At the European level, I mean, I agree with you about citizens' assemblies, but I think we need both, actually. I think we need to combine the two.
Okay, I'm up for ways of combining the two.
Some of us proposed, they had a great public consultation last year on the future of Europe. And some of us proposed that the European Parliament moves from Strasbourg to Brussels all the time.
I don't know how it works. I'm not a European, so I don't know.
So, well, anyway, the European Parliament only has one chamber. We suggested that Strasbourg should become a second chamber, although it would be linked with transnational. I mean, and it should be a permanent citizens' assembly. And the idea is that you can have different types of citizens' assemblies. So you can have the one you're talking about, sortition, which is really important. And you could do it not just in Strasbourg, you could move it all around Europe, or you could have it online.
Yeah, but online.
But you could also provide a space in Strasbourg for Helsinki type citizens' assemblies. So this is what we proposed. And actually, interestingly enough, for the future of Europe, the EU did actually organise its own citizens' assemblies to contribute to the.
Tell me more about that because I didn't know that, and I want to know. I like to put on forums about citizens' assemblies because it's my hobby horse. And
Well, the person that you should interview is Calypso Nicolaides.
Good. I'll try
She's at the European University Institute, and she's a passionate pro-citizens' assemblies and has been organising them herself.
Okay.
So you should talk to her, but they did organise them in order to get results for the future of Europe, not that the future of Europe ended up by being that interesting, to tell you the truth. I don't know why not. But anyway, they did organise them. So there's a lot of interest inside the European Union in developing citizens' assemblies.
Okay, now I could go with this a long time, but I really want to get back to your thing because I'm not sure what you are going to recommend. Out of your, I don't know, I still don't understand long waves, but you're seeing.
I suppose the end result, and maybe I should have started with that, is that we can't solve the global economic problems without solving global peace and war problems.
Mm-hmm.
So, you and I have for long advocated for a human rights-based liberal world order, and that has to be linked with a new model of economic development that's global, green, addresses climate change, addresses new technologies, and addresses global inequalities. So the link, but we have to keep those together. You can't just put them in separate boxes. I suppose that's more than anything what I'm arguing for.
Okay, got it. I think we may. I don't see any issue there, but we are not going in that direction. We are going in the direction of nationalism. Every little country is going to be trying to, just retreat into its own borders and hope that Trump doesn't come and gobble them up.
They're all going to follow the Trump model because that's the only way you can win power, given that you can't solve economic problems. You blame it on the other.
Yeah.
So,
do you have any hope? I mean, where would you put your bets if you were to you have some chips or something, and you have to invest them in?
well, I suppose where I would put my debt is in the European Union, but in the European Union following a very different strategy to now, which it may be on the verge of. I mean, Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, when he was elected, said it's 5 minutes to midnight, 4 minutes to midnight for the European Union. I mean, the most likely outcome of Trump and Putin, their goal is to destabilize the European Union and spread authoritarianism. And if the European Union succeeds in resisting this, that's where I see hope.
Well, God bless them. How I don't know what to make of Mertz. Is he our savior?
He could be. He could be. I mean, he's right wing. He's not at all what we're thinking of, but his speech on being elected was that we have to deal with this issue. He wasn't just talking about substituting for America in Ukraine. He was also talking about addressing the problems that have given rise to the AFD.
What are those problems that give rise to? I mean, that's the question.
I think it is neoliberalism, and in the German case, it's the debt brake, if you know what the debt brake is.
No, I don't know anything about that.
Neoliberalism is built into the German constitution. I think Merkel did that. So you're not allowed to exceed the budget deficit of 3.5%, which means that they've not been able to spend for a very long time. There's a limit on how much they can spend, which means that you've got growing inequality and the large parts of, particularly in the former East Germany, people who no longer are working in the Fordist factories. Those are the sort of basic people who are attracted to the AFD.
What can you say about the attraction to the AFD that explains attraction to similar movements elsewhere? What is it that makes Musk?
Well, I think there's huge. Well, I think there are two things which are quite separate. I mean, one is the rise of oligarchy, which is very important. But the other is when we did local studies of why people voted for Brexit, what comes out is something which comes out on the left too, is this huge sense of disempowerment. That nobody listens to your problems, that nobody cares, nobody does anything about it. And you're ready to vote for anybody who offers dramatic change, even if it's horrible change. And you're quite happy. I guess the difference between the left behind and the sort of more middle-class studenty people is the left behind are willing to blame it on immigration, whether it's true or false. Whereas the left have more of not all the left. I mean, some of the left are now crazy. I mean, and then you combine that with Musk and social media and all that stuff.
If you look at things like Gallup polls or Pew or something, go around asking, what is it that really makes you mad, that you just boil over and you want to kill somebody? When was the last time you were so furious? What was it about? And it was about seeing some kind of injustice, being victimized in an unjust way, and or being frustrated by something the government or some big corporation or bureaucracy is inefficient enough and inhumane enough so that they stick with some stupid rules about how they are going to process your application, and then they make it impossible for you to find your way through it. So you just plain can't get anywhere. There's no room for human mercy.
Absolutely.
And so this is where people are really angry, but that you do not see any political movement at all offering them relief for that. And this is where I think if there's the word Marxian concept of false consciousness is nobody has given them a label, a proper analysis or diagnosis of that frustration and that distress.
Well, what they do. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we had this brief period when Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not actually a fan of Corbyn himself, but nevertheless, they were explaining the problems as they are, and they were hugely popular. And the lengths that the social media, the pro-Israeli lobby, all of these people went to discredit. I mean, I think Corbyn made lots of mistakes, actually, particularly on Brexit. But in fact, he won a bigger share of the vote in 2019 when Boris Johnson won a huge victory than Keir Starmer did last summer.
Okay. Well, I think they don't, the politicians have not given people any formula for how they're going to solve that at all. Um, and until they do, that people have to vote for on issues that I don't think they really matter. I mean, why would the average person care that much about what toilets boys and girls use? I mean, they're given a list of considerations or issues that they have to care about, which is not really what they care about, and they're not given an opportunity to say what they really need to have done. So I think that's where we could have introduce mechanisms for things like panels of citizens assemblies, so that if you can't find it a way to fill out the tax form, you can go to these, you can demand that they fix tax forms that a human being can actually fill out without having to pay an accountant to do it for you. And then accountants, 60% of the accountants make mistakes anyway.
The other thing to say is, I thought Biden's Inflation, whatever it was called, Reduction Act,
Mhm.
you know, that those two things he did, he poured a huge amount of money into climate change technology.
Mhm.
And so what went wrong? Why didn't people support it?
People are not aware of climate. Most people, even especially politicians, are not aware that we're it's almost inevitable we're going to have 10 feet of ocean rise, because the Thwaites Glacier, if nothing else, is going to break off because they're not doing anything. I don't know whether they could save it
I
now,
know it was
but
not
it's going
just,
to
I
raise
mean,
global oceans
but
and eliminate all the cities on the coast everywhere. And
I
they're not
know.
talking about that.
No, people don't care about that. But the theory was that if you put a huge investment into climate change, that will generate new jobs, will improve the economy, and then that will improve people's lives. And that argument that actually investing in climate change is also a way of producing growth and improving people's lives seems to me a very good argument. That was the argument of the Green New Deal. And Biden tried to put it into practice, and it just didn't have any effect. So why?
Okay, I don't know the answer, but I think it's because most of the um, investments are not going to be visible in the economy right away. That you can't overnight build, you know, all the windmills in the ocean that you want, or let's say, I don't think he's invested in farms of seaweed, which is one important thing. I have 1,000 different things that could be done, but they are not being done. They're and I don't know whether Biden's investment would have actually led to any of those big time projects. I'm talking about things I don't know anything about here, so forgive me.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I suspect part of the answer is that he did do it in the classic contracting out way, giving lots of projects to different. So a lot of the money,
It's
I
a
don't
lot
know.
of infrastructure. They're going to fix bridges, which they need, but that's not high tech. It doesn't really solve climate. It just, you what else? Not even, I mean, they're not even making much progress with things like fast trains. The US and Canada still don't have a good train system, and the one they've been trying to build in California for the last 20 years, they can't get rights to build on build the tracks. I don't know. Okay, I'm distracting you, dear.
Yes, I think I need, but
Pitch.
maybe we should have talked about non-nuclear deterrence. But I think what I need, but it helped me in thinking I need to find a clearer way to describe what my book's about.
Well, yeah, you did lose me when it came to long waves, because I don't know anything about that. Tell me, where'd you even get the idea?
They're
Predict the next.
sometimes called cycles and sometimes called surges.
Yeah.
And what is that lots of people have observed since the 1920s that the global economy since the mid 17th century has gone in 50-year cycles. And these 50-year cycles have been associated with a bunching together of technology. So it starts with the Industrial Revolution and the factory system. Then the next phase is machinery and railways. The next phase is electricity, and I can't remember what. And then comes cars and oil. And each of these phases have their ups and downs. You start slowly, then suddenly it takes off, and then it gets subject to diminishing returns, and there are new inventions, but you reach a kind of crisis point because the new inventions are in a way constrained by the past. That's my brief description of long waves.
But these are just economic. There's now. What does that have to do with political?
Well, there are equally theories of long waves in politics, the idea of the rise and fall of great powers.
Okay.
That there are big moments when hegemony shifts from, I don't know, Portugal to the Netherlands to Britain to the United States.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And actually, these sort of parallel, but you know what? I kind of don't want to get into. Long waves are a starting point for the book, but the book is not about long waves. The book's about now, and it's about the contradiction between Fordism, which is my name for the American-dominated model of development based on cars, roads, the intensive use of oil that we've experienced since the Second World War. And our institutions were really shaped around that. And somehow we haven't been able to adapt to a world of information communications technology, let alone AI, gene editing, and all the other things that are coming along. And it's about adapting institutions in a way that's what it's really about.
Okay. All right. Because
and the key point that I'm trying to make about civil society and social movements is that they're in a way the carriers of the new ideas that come out of this contradiction, and they may be very good ideas or they may be terrible ideas.
If you were given control of all the EU decisions, give me your game plan.
My game plan would be, one, to greatly enhance democracy in the EU, both the role of the European Parliament and a parallel citizens' assembly. Two, to hugely increase EU-level spending, both through issuing debt from the central bank and through taxing multinational corporations, taxing the global bads, taxing carbon, taxing financial speculation. Mm-hmm. And then I would spend that money on adapting to climate change, on contributing to a global technological organization to think about AI and all these other technologies, to addressing poverty in the world, including inside the EU. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, strengthening the United Nations and blah, 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 blah.
Okay, blah, blah, blah. It's interesting you threw the United Nations in as kind of an afterthought. I would have started with the United Nations, trying to figure out how to reform that. Not that I think there's much hope, but I don't know that there's that much hope for EU either.
So interesting about this meeting in Geneva. The Chinese person was just passionate about the United Nations.
Really?
Yeah, and she was the official Chinese delegate.
Well, I don't know. What have they been doing at the UN one way or another? I
Well,
don't.
they're the second largest funder.
I haven't heard of the any reformist movement for the UN being led by any Chinese people. Are
Not reformist movements, but they fund the UN and they think the UN is really important.
well, good. I do too, and I think I don't know that it's the easiest place to start, but of course I don't know enough about the EU, and maybe you think you've got a hope there that the EU can be.
I suppose what I think is that the UN does depend on its member states. And the EU is offering a kind of model of global governance that isn't, of course, global, it's regional. But if it acted together, could really have a very powerful influence on the EU too, on the UN too.
I but the UN isn't set up with a seat for the EU. It's set up for seats for the countries, and
Yeah, well, that's one of the reforms. Well, except I think the Security Council should be reformed generally, but it's ridiculous that Britain and France is represented rather than it should be maybe regional organizations, the AU, the EU. You know, we could think in those terms.
in a regional organization, not every country that wants to join is allowed in. You're not. It's very questionable whether Ukraine will be able to join EU. Not even to mention NATO, but EU.
No, no, I'm talking about a future.
Yeah.
I think the Ukraine will join EU, actually.
Okay. Well, here's where I would agree that that's something to hope for.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think you have some influence in Europe, despite living in England.
I've just become a Hungarian citizen.
No kidding. Oh, that's wonderful. I believe if I could become a citizen of about 10 different countries, I would. Uh,
Yeah.
so
Well, it was quite an effort, and this was the easiest. I mean, I just didn't want not to be a European citizen. And actually, I realize even now, nobody's noticed it in Barcelona. I'm actually here illegally because I haven't applied for a work visa. But in fact, if I'm as a Hungarian, I haven't yet got my passport, but as a Hungarian citizen, it's totally legal.
well, that's wonderful. But
If I mean, I certainly wouldn't want only to be a Hungarian citizen.
yeah, certainly not today. But
Exactly.
once you straighten them out, it'll be a better deal. I'm sure you and Orban will have a conversation, and he will be persuaded, and everything will be all right.
Well, you know, you don't do. Were you in END as well as HCA, or only HCA?
Only HCA. No, in both. In both. I attended some ENG meetings. Yeah.
Did you attend the one in Lund?
No.
No. I mean,
Every and Moscow. The last one was in Moscow.
yeah.
And,
Well,
the others.
certainly, I think Orban was in every.
Was he? Hmm.
Yeah. Yes, the book is about great moments of historical change, and the one we're in at the present. So that's what it's primarily about. Maybe I don't need all the background stuff, but it's where it got me to here.
But also the question of agency, because I feel
I think there are two things. I mean, the contradiction between the political and the economic is hugely important, and the question of agency is hugely important.
But right now, do you feel you have agency? I know you're a big shot, so you probably do have some agency. I don't. I mean, I listen to people and I have some ideas, but I don't think they're going to go anywhere, and I don't see any
It's
prospect of
funny. I just actually something you should put in Peace magazine. Let
what.
me tell you about it.
Mhm.
So before Christmas, I organized a meeting of Russian and Ukrainian human rights defenders from inside Russia and Ukraine.
Mhm. Good.
And they decided they wanted to run a campaign about calling for a human dimension to the negotiations. And they've started a campaign called People First, which calls for freeing of all the captives of the war. That's prisoners of war, civilians, the children who've been taken to Russia. And the campaign's really taken off inside Ukraine and inside Russia. And indeed, in Zelensky's statement, I think at the end, he actually refers to it. He talks about freeing the captives and how to take humans first. But actually, it's been really difficult mobilizing interest in the rest of Europe. People, so it would be great if you did something in Peace Magazine on that and got some Canadian interest in it.
Okay. Let me see if I can connect to this to something I have been working on, because for one thing, it's too late to do a new story, but I can start a story for the next issue about what you're suggesting if I understand what it might amount to. And what I have been working on with no effect whatever is the plight of the Russian men who fled to avoid being sent to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians. And there were 1 million of them who left the country and are stuck. Most, I don't know that there are millions still around, but 1 million or so left, and they are stuck in various countries where they don't really have any intention of being, mostly in the what had been the Soviet countries, Kazakhstan or Georgia or whatever. And because you can get into those with only an internal passport. And to get to other countries, you have to have an external passport. And for that, you have to go back to Russia, which of course they'd go to jail if they did. So they can't go back to Russia, and therefore they can't move on to other countries. And other countries will do nothing to help them and don't admit them, and they regard them all as potential spies or something of that kind. Well, I've been trying for 2 years now to set up forum conversations about how to help these poor blokes, and sometimes their families. They've followed them, and I can't seem to get any body wanting to talk about it. People in the government won't. I talked to Bob Ray, the Canadian ambassador to the UN, and he wasn't even allowed. He had to check, and he wasn't even allowed to be on the show if there were Russians there. So he talked to me about it, and of course he didn't know much because he didn't talk to any Russians. But Ottawa won't even let them talk about it. And then I try to get people at the World Council on Refugees and Migration or something like that. And they drag their feet. They won't, yeah, someday we'll do it or something. I can't get anybody to do it. And I can't get lawyers. I can't get anybody. What is the matter with people that they don't want to help these poor guys? We should be out there with garlands of flowers for them when they arrive.
It's incredible. Because there are also 1 million or so inside Russia who are in hiding.
And a lot of them not just in hiding, but in jail. Several, I think 100,000 or something, are actually imprisoned so far. I read a number the other day. They're not all men or anything, but any protester can be.
Yeah, the prisons, they've let everybody go who said they would join the war. Mm-hmm. And they've imprisoned everybody who was against the war. But what is amazing about the Russian groups that were at my meeting is they work very much, undercover with all, they hide conscientious objectors, they help Ukrainian civilians escape. It's amazing what they do.
Well,
and nobody knows.
Let's talk about having some forums with these people, and then putting,
Well, I will send you the link to the People's First website as soon as this call is over.
Good.
And then you can look at it. And also, I did a piece in The Nation last week. So I'll send you both those things.
Please do. Okay, wonderful. It's
okay.
A treat to talk to you, and I will be your follower, but I have to figure out where you're going to lead me.
Okay. I have to figure out how to explain it in more simple terms.
And have
Bye.
Barcelona. Enjoy it for me. Okay.
Bye.